who ran away from their own wedding. What happened? Story 1. I left my wedding an hour before the ceremony. The dress was on, the guests were seated, and my fiancé was probably practicing his vows in the other room. I should have been excited, but instead, I felt like I was suffocating. It wasn't sudden, it was a slow buildup. Over the last few months, every decision felt like it wasn't mine. My fiancé's family was overbearing, and he never stood up. The final straw was when his mother told me, "Once you're married, you'll learn your place." I sat in the bridal suite, staring at myself in the mirror, and I realized I didn't want this life. So I took off the veil, grabbed my purse, and walked out the back door. I got into my maid of honor's car, who had suspected I might back out, and she drove me straight to the airport. I turned off my phone and disappeared for 2 weeks. My ex didn't chase me. I heard later that his mother blamed me for ruining everything. Honestly, best decision I ever made. Story 2. I made it all the way to the altar before my brain screamed, "Run!" I loved my fiancé, or at least I thought I did. But standing there, looking at him, I suddenly saw our future. The constant fights, the way he belittled my dreams, how he always forgot to include me in big decisions. And I realized I was about to marry a man who didn't actually see me as an equal. So I did something insane. I turned to the crowd, said, "I'm sorry, I can't do this," and walked away. The silence was deafening. His mother gasped. My dad just sighed, like he'd been expecting it. My ex stood frozen, humiliated. And then I heard my best friend laughing, because she knew I was finally doing something for myself. It took months to recover from the fallout, but I never regretted it. Some people called me a coward. I think I was just finally brave enough to choose myself. Story 3. It was the morning of my wedding when I saw it. An anonymous message with screenshots. My fiancé had been cheating on me with his best man for over a year. I felt sick. I confronted him in private, hoping for some sort of explanation. Instead, he just looked at me and said, "I was going to tell you eventually." Like that made it better. I walked out of the venue, still in my wedding dress, and went straight to a bar down the street. The bartender gave me free drinks after hearing my story, and by the time my friends found me, I was halfway to drunk and feeling oddly relieved. His family tried to guilt-trip me into still going through with it. For the guests, yeah, no thanks. I sent out a mass text telling everyone to enjoy the food, but there wouldn't be a wedding. Then I booked a flight and spent the next week on a solo honeymoon. No regrets. Story 4. I didn't actually plan to leave. I was fully prepared to marry my high school sweetheart, even though deep down, I knew something was off. But fate intervened in the form of a power outage. Right as I was about to walk down the aisle, the entire venue lost electricity. Chaos ensued. Guests were panicking, and my fiancé was furious. I saw how he snapped at the staff, yelled at my little cousin for asking questions, and completely ignored me in his rage. And that's when it hit me. This wasn't a man who would handle life's challenges with patience or kindness. This was who he really was. So while everyone scrambled to fix the situation, I slipped away. I walked to the parking lot, called my sister, and told her, "Come get me." She didn't even ask questions. Hours later, when the lights came back on, my ex was furious to find out his bride had left instead of waiting around. But if he couldn't handle a temporary blackout, how was he going to handle a marriage? Story 5. I was waiting in the bridal suite, wearing the most expensive dress I'd ever owned, when my grandmother sat beside me and said, "Sweetheart, if you don't want to do this, you don't have to. We can leave right now." I hadn't said a word about my doubts. I hadn't told anyone how, for months, I had this gnawing feeling that I was making a mistake. But somehow she knew. I burst into tears. I told her everything. How my fiancé was emotionally distant, how he dismissed my concerns, how I felt like I was marrying him out of obligation, not love. She didn't hesitate. She grabbed my hand, pulled me up, and walked me right out of that venue. No explanations, no dramatics. She just told the family she's made her choice. Some people were furious. My ex was humiliated. But my grandma, she took me to a diner, ordered us pancakes, and said, "Better a broken engagement than a broken marriage." She was right. Story 6. I was standing at the altar, seconds away from saying, "I do." Then my fiancé leaned in and whispered, "I know about the baby." I felt my stomach drop. He thought I was pregnant. I wasn't. But that meant someone else was. I turned my head slowly and looked at him. He smirked. He thought he had trapped me. He thought I'd go through with the wedding because I wouldn't want the scandal of walking away. But I did. I turned to the guests, took a deep breath, and said loud enough for everyone to hear, "I think my fiancé just confessed to getting someone else pregnant." Gasps. Silence. Then murmurs. His face went pale. Without another word, I picked up my dress, walked down the aisle, and left the venue. My best friend ran after me. She took me straight to her car. We drove away as my phone exploded with messages. He tried to backtrack, said it was a joke, said I misunderstood. But I knew better. Dodged a bullet. Story 7. 3 days before the wedding, I got a text from a random number. If you marry him, you'll regret it. Ask him about Heather. I showed him the text. He laughed it off. Said it was a jealous ex. Said he had no idea who Heather was. But he wouldn't let me see his phone. That night, when he fell asleep, I checked his laptop. I wasn't even looking for anything specific, just a gut feeling. And I found it. Emails. Messages. A whole other relationship. With a woman named Heather. For the last 6 years, I didn't cry. I didn't scream. I just packed my bags and left. I booked a hotel for the night and sent one single message before blocking him. Tell Heather she can have the wedding. I won't be there. Then I messaged the venue, the caterer, and my guests. Told them it was off. He found out when he showed up to an empty wedding hall. He tried to explain later. Tried to apologize. But I never looked back. Story 8. My wedding day was perfect. The sun was shining. The flowers were beautiful. The guests were happy. Too bad the groom wasn't. An hour before the ceremony, I overheard my fiancé talking to his best man. He didn't know I was standing behind the door. I mean, she's great and all, but it's not like I'm in love with her. Marriage is just what you do, right? I felt like I had been punched in the stomach. I could have confronted him. I could have asked him why he was marrying me if he didn't love me, but I realized I didn't need an answer. I calmly walked back to the bridal suite, took off my dress, put on my normal clothes, and left. No big speech, no public meltdown. Just a quiet exit. When he finally realized I was gone, he called me over and over. I never picked up. His last text just said, I didn't mean it like that. But I think he did. Story 9. I left my wedding in the most humiliating way possible. I was nervous all morning, but I thought that was normal. Cold feet, right? Until I actually stood at the altar. Then it hit me. This wasn't nerves. This was wrong. My chest got tight. My vision blurred. I started shaking. The officiant asked me if I took him as my husband, and my mind went blank. I physically could not say yes. I muttered, I'm sorry, and then I fainted. Right there, in front of everyone. When I woke up, I was in the bridal suite, surrounded by my mom, my maid of honor, and a very, very angry groom. He wasn't worried about me. He wasn't asking if I was okay. He was furious that I had embarrassed him. And that's when I knew I had to leave. My mom drove me home. My dad handled the guests. I never saw my ex again. Story 10. I was set to marry the perfect guy. Handsome, successful, charming. Everyone adored him. But what no one knew was that he was controlling as hell. 6 months into our engagement, he started making little rules. No more late nights out. No more wearing dresses that were too short. No more talking to male coworkers. At first, I thought he was just being protective. But it kept getting worse. The night before our wedding, he sat me down and gave me a list of expectations. It included things like, always make his plate before mine. No solo vacations. No more guy friends. No questioning his decisions. I stared at him. I felt numb. Then I asked, what happens if I break a rule? He smiled and said, you won't. The next morning, instead of walking down the aisle, I walked straight out of the house, blocked his number, got my own place. He sent a single email 2 weeks later. You'll regret this. But I never did. Story 11. I ran away from my wedding with my fiancé's father. Before you judge, let me explain. My fiancé and I had been together for 5 years. But in that time, he had become more controlling, manipulative, and just cold. It wasn't obvious at first, but by the time we were engaged, I felt more like a trophy than a partner. His dad, on the other hand, was nothing like him. Kind, supportive, always checking in on me, asking how I was really feeling. I never thought much of it. Until the night before the wedding. I broke down in tears, telling his father how much I regretted everything, how I felt like I was making a mistake. He looked at me and said, then don't do it. You deserve more than this. The next morning, as I stood in my dress, heart racing, I looked out at the crowd and made eye contact with him. He gave me the smallest nod, like he already knew what I was about to do. I turned around, walked out, and got into his car. We drove away, and that was that. His son went ballistic. His ex-wife, my would-be mother-in-law, nearly had a breakdown. But we didn't care. A few months later, we started dating. Now we're married, and I have never been happier. Story 12. The night before my wedding, my fiancé told me, you'll make a great wife. I mean, you're not my dream girl, but you'll do. I laughed, thinking it was a joke. It wasn't. So I asked, who's your dream girl? He didn't even hesitate. He just said, you don't know her. That's when I knew. I was about to marry a man who saw me as a consolation prize. I stayed up all night thinking about it. I wasn't even mad, just disgusted with myself for not seeing it sooner. The next morning, I walked up to him right before the ceremony and said, "Actually, you're not my dream guy either, but I found someone better." His face turned red. He stammered, "Who?" I smiled and said, "Me." Then I left. Story 13. My wedding day turned into a crime scene. Right before the ceremony, the police showed up and arrested my fiancé. Turns out he had been leading a double life. He wasn't just my sweet, hardworking, soon-to-be husband. He was a con artist. His real name wasn't even what I thought it was. He had stolen thousands from people, had multiple fake businesses, and was apparently already married to someone else in another state. I stood there in my wedding dress, watching them put him in handcuffs, and all I could think was, how the hell did I miss this? The guests were in shock. His family tried to cover it up, acting like it was just some misunderstanding. But the cops had evidence. Lots of it. Needless to say, I never saw him again. Story 14. I ran away from my wedding on a motorcycle. Not mine. My ex's. The one my fiancé made me cut out of my life. See, my ex and I were best friends before we ever dated. We had this deep, unbreakable bond. But when I got engaged, my fiancé demanded that I cut him off completely. Said it was disrespectful to our relationship. So, I did. Fast forward to the wedding day. I was standing in the back, moments from walking down the aisle, when I heard the sound of a motorcycle engine. I peeked outside and there he was, my ex, helmet off, leaning against his bike, staring right at me. He didn't say anything. He didn't have to. I felt my heart slam against my chest. For the first time in months, I felt like myself again. So, I did something crazy. I grabbed my dress, ran out the side door, and jumped on the back of his bike. The guests screamed. My fiancé lost his mind. But as we sped away, wind in my hair, I knew I had just saved myself from a life I didn't want. Story 15. I called off my wedding because of a single sentence. The morning of the ceremony, my fiancé's grandmother pulled me aside. She'd always been sweet to me, so I wasn't expecting what came next. She looked me in the eyes and said, "You know, dear, once you say yes, there's no way out. Women in this family don't divorce." I laughed nervously. "Well, I hope we won't have to." She just smiled. Then she said, "That's what the last one said, too. She's been miserable for 20 years. My entire body went cold. I had noticed red flags before, but I ignored them because I thought love meant making sacrifices. But hearing that, that's when I realized this wasn't just a bad idea. This was a trap. I left before anyone could stop me. I sent one text to my fiancé. "I refuse to be another miserable wife in your family. You can thank your grandma for the wake-up call." I blocked his number. Never looked back. Story 16. I ran away from my wedding because my fiancé's family treated me like a maid. It started small. His mom would call me to help clean their house. His sisters would ask me to do errands. His dad once told me that I needed to learn how to serve a husband properly. I thought it was just their way of welcoming me into the family. But then, the night before our wedding, his mother handed me a list of household duties I was expected to do once I was officially a wife. Cook every meal. Do all the laundry. Give his parents grandkids as soon as possible. I laughed, thinking it was a joke. She just smiled and said, "Marriage is about duty, dear. I'm so glad my son picked a good, obedient girl." That night, I packed my things and left. I sent my fiancé a text. "I'm marrying a husband, not a second family. You can find another obedient girl. I'm out." His mom lost her mind. He begged me to come back, saying we could talk about it. But if he let them treat me like a servant before marriage, I knew it would only get worse after. I don't regret leaving for a second. Story 17. I left my wedding because my fiancé made a joke that wasn't a joke. Right before we exchanged vows, the officiant asked if we had any personal words to say. I had written this heartfelt speech about how much I loved him, how excited I was to build a life together. When it was his turn, he smirked and said, "Well, we all know marriage is just the end of a man's freedom. But I guess I'll survive, right?" The guests laughed. I waited for him to say something real, something meaningful, but he just grinned, nudged his best man, and said, "Guess the ball and chain is officially locked on." I felt my face burn. I looked at him, then at the crowd. They all thought it was funny. I didn't. I took a deep breath and said, "Actually, I've changed my mind." Then I turned around and walked out. Half the room gasped. My mom ran after me. My fiancé, ex-fiancé, just stood there, dumbfounded. Later, he texted me, "It was just a joke, but a joke reveals the truth." And I wasn't about to marry someone who saw me as a life sentence. Story 18. I ran away from my wedding because of a letter I wasn't supposed to see. I was getting ready, makeup half done, when my maid of honor came in, pale as a ghost. She handed me a crumpled letter. "I found this in the groom's room," she whispered. It was from my fiancé. To his ex. I know this is crazy, but I have to say it. If you tell me to, I'll call off the wedding. I never stopped loving you. If you want me, just say the word. The letter was dated 3 days ago. I stared at it, feeling like the air had been punched out of my lungs. My maid of honor grabbed my hands and said, "What do you want to do?" I looked in the mirror, looked at my dress, looked at the life I almost stepped into. Then I stood up and said, "Get my car keys." I left without a word, turned my phone off, blocked his number. Later, I heard that his ex never responded. He got left at the altar alone. He tried to said he was just getting closure. But if you still need closure 3 days before marrying someone else, you're not ready for marriage. Story 19. I ran away from my wedding because of my fiance's reaction to spilled wine. At the rehearsal dinner, one of my little cousins accidentally knocked over a glass of red wine onto my fiance's white shirt. Instead of brushing it off, he snapped. His entire face changed. He grabbed the kid's wrist hard and growled, "Do you even know how much this shirt costs?" My cousin burst into tears. I jumped in, pulling him away, saying, "It's just a shirt." But my fiance just glared at me and said, "Do you always have to defend everyone?" The whole room went dead silent. That night I laid awake, replaying it over and over. I thought about the times he got annoyed when I took too long ordering food. The times he got mad at waiters for minor mistakes. I saw the pattern. So the next morning, instead of walking down the aisle, I walked out. My dad met me in the parking lot, already holding my suitcase. He just nodded and said, "I was hoping you'd figure it out before it was too late." Story 20. I ran away from my wedding because of a pre-written apology letter. It was hidden in my fiance's desk. I wasn't looking for anything suspicious. I was just grabbing a pen. But when I saw an envelope labeled "In case she finds out," I knew I had to open it. Inside was a detailed apology, apologizing for cheating on, for lying to me, for not telling me sooner. It was dated 5 months ago. 5 months. I sat there, numb. This meant he already knew he would get caught eventually. He was already planning to apologize. But instead of telling me, he just waited until I found out myself. I didn't say a word to him, didn't scream, didn't cry. I just put the letter back, grabbed my keys, and drove away. Later, when he realized I was gone, he called me over and over. I sent him a single text, "I found your letter." Then I blocked him. Story 21. I left my wedding because I saw my future, and it was terrifying. It was during the reception, right after the ceremony. My new husband had already started drinking heavily, laughing with his friends while I sat there, completely ignored. Then, his uncle leaned over and said something that chilled me to my core. "Enjoy the happy moments while they last. The men in this family don't stay romantic for long." I turned to him, confused. He just smiled and added, "We're providers, not lovers. Just ask my wife." I glanced at his wife across the table. She looked exhausted, empty, like she hadn't laughed in years. I realized that would be me in 20 years. I stood up, grabbed my purse, and walked out of my own reception. My husband barely noticed I was gone. By the time he realized, I was already on a plane to my sister's house, divorce papers in hand. Story 22. I ran away from my wedding because my fiancé turned our vows into a joke. I spent weeks writing my vows. They were emotional, heartfelt, full of all the reasons I loved him. When it was his turn, he grinned and said, "I promise to tolerate your shopping addiction as long as you keep looking hot." The guests laughed. I didn't. He wasn't done. "I promise to put up with your constant overthinking, even when you make drama out of nothing." More laugh. More people looking at me, expecting me to smile along. But I wasn't laughing. I realized, standing there, that he didn't see me as an equal. He saw me as a joke. Someone to tease, someone to tolerate, someone to put up with. So when the officiant asked if I took him as my husband, I said, "No, actually, I don't." Then I turned around and walked away. He didn't chase me. He was too embarrassed. But I felt free. Story 23. I left my wedding because my dog didn't like my fiancé. Sounds stupid, right? But hear me out. I have a golden retriever, Max. He's never growled at anyone. Ever. But from the moment my fiancé moved in, Max hated. He growled, barked, hid from him. I thought he was just adjusting. But then, I started noticing things. Max would flinch when my fiancé moved too fast. He refused to go near him when I wasn't home. Once I came home early and found my fiancé yelling at him, face red, fist clenched. When I confronted him, he brushed it off. He's just a dumb dog. He'll get used to me. On my wedding day, Max wouldn't stop barking. I kneeled down, trying to calm him, and he looked at me with this desperate, pleading expression, like he was saying, "Please don't do this." And I knew. I took off my veil, kissed Max on the head, and left. Turns out my gut was right. A month later, I found out he had a history of hurting animals. Max saved. Story 24. I left my wedding because of a wedding gift. It was from my fiance's grandmother. A beautifully wrapped box with a handwritten note attached. For my grandson's future wife, may this guide you through marriage as it did for me. Inside, a worn-out marriage handbook. I flipped through it and my stomach dropped. Your husband's needs come first, always. Never question his authority in front of others. If he raises his voice, you probably deserve it. Men stray, it's a wife's job to forgive. I looked at my fiancé. He was laughing with his friends, completely unaware that his entire family expected me to become a silent, obedient wife. Then I looked at his mom, then his grandma. Their tired, hollow faces. I closed the box, set it on the table, and walked out. My fiancé ran after me, demanding to know what was wrong. I just held up the book and said, I refuse to end up like your mother. And I never looked back. Story 25. I ran away from my wedding because my fiancé made a bet about me. I was in the bridal suite, sipping champagne, when my maid of honor ran in, shaking. She could barely get the words out. But when she did, I felt my world shatter. My fiancé had made a bet with his friends, years ago, that he could make me fall in love with him and marry him. At first, it was a joke. But then I actually fell for him. And instead of stopping, instead of admitting the truth, he kept playing the game. Right up until the wedding day. I stormed into the groom's room and asked if it was true. His face said everything. He tried to explain, saying it wasn't like that and that he really did love me now. I just shook my head and walked out. The wedding guests were confused. The families were panicked. But I didn't care, because I deserved real love, not a game. Story 26. I left my wedding because I was never supposed to be the bride. Sounds insane, right? But let me explain. My fiancé had been with his ex, Sophie, for 8 years. They were high school sweethearts. Everyone expected them to get married. Then, out of nowhere, he broke up with her. 2 months later, he was dating me. A year after that, we were engaged. Something always felt off. He never talked about their breakup. He kept their photos in a box instead of deleting them. His mom slipped once and said, "You're different from Sophie, but I guess that's not a bad." On our wedding day, I was in the bridal suite when my cousin ran in. Panicked. She had overheard my fiancé talking to his brother. He said, "I still think about Sophie. If she walked in right now and asked me to leave, I would." I felt my entire body go cold. I didn't cry. I didn't scream. I just walked out. Didn't tell him. Didn't tell anyone. I just left the venue and took the first bus out of town. When he realized I was gone, he called me over and over. I sent a single text. "I hope Sophie shows up for you because I never should have." Then I blocked his number. Story 27. I ran away from my wedding because of an uninvited guest. The ceremony had already started. I was standing at the altar holding my fiancé's hands, about to say my vows. Then, the doors swung open. A woman walked in, holding a baby. She looked right at my fiancé and said, "You weren't going to tell her, were you?" Silence. I looked at him. His face said everything. I let go of his hands, took a step back. He stammered, trying to explain, but I was already turning around. As I walked past the woman, she whispered, "I'm sorry." I nodded. She wasn't the one who betrayed me. My fiancé tried to chase after me. His mother started crying. The guests were in complete shock. I just kept walking, straight out of that building, straight into my new life, without him. Story 28. I left my wedding because of an accident. Not a car crash, not an injury, something worse. As I was getting ready, my fiancé's phone buzzed. It was sitting on the table, and without thinking, I glanced at the screen. It was a text from his best friend. "Dude, you really left your phone unlocked? You're gonna get yourself caught." My stomach dropped. My hands shaking, I picked up his phone and scrolled. There it was. Months of messages with another woman. Explicit texts. Photos. Plans to meet up one last time before he got married. I felt like I was going to be sick. I didn't wait. Didn't ask for an explanation. I just grabbed my purse, walked out of the bridal suite, and left. He realized too late. By the time he checked his phone, I was already gone. Story 29. I ran away from my wedding because my fiancé made a toast to his real soulmate. We were at the rehearsal dinner. Everything was perfect. Until it was time for speeches. He stood up, smiled at me, and said, "I just want to thank the person who's been by my side through everything." I thought he meant me. But then he turned to his female best friend. "I don't know where I'd be without you," he said. "You've always been my rock, my safe place. I can't imagine life without you." The room was silent. I looked at her. She was tearing up. I looked at my fiancé, and I just knew. He was in love with her. Maybe he didn't realize it. Maybe he convinced himself I was the right choice. But I wasn't about to marry someone whose heart belonged to someone else. So that night I packed my bags and left. I heard later that he tried calling me for days, that his best friend eventually confessed she loved him too. I hope they worked it out. But I wasn't going to be anyone's second choice. Story 30. I left my wedding because of a prenup. Not because I refused to sign it, but because of what was in it. The night before the wedding, my fiance's lawyer handed me a folder. Inside was a 50-page document. I skimmed through it, expecting the usual financial protections, asset agreements. Then I saw Section 3. The wife agrees to maintain a weight under 140 pounds. I blinked. Kept reading. The wife agrees not to cut her hair without the husband's approval. The wife will not deny intimacy more than 3 times per month. I felt sick. I turned to my fiancé, expecting him to laugh, to say it was a mistake. He just shrugged and said, "It's standard. Nothing crazy." I closed the folder, set it on the table, and stood up. "Enjoy your wedding," I said. "I won't be there." Then I walked out. Story 31. I left my wedding because of a dream. I know how that sounds. Crazy. But hear me out. The night before my wedding, I had a vivid dream. I was standing at the altar looking into my fiancé's eyes. The officiant asked, "Do you take this man?" I opened my mouth, but nothing came out. Then, my fiancé's face changed. He wasn't smiling. His eyes were cold. His grip on my hands tightened. I tried to pull away. He wouldn't let go. The officiant kept repeating, "Do you take this man? Do you take this man?" over and over, louder and louder, until it felt like I was drowning. I woke up gasping for air. My chest was tight. My hands were shaking. And I knew. It wasn't just a dream. It was my gut screaming at me. That morning, instead of walking down the aisle, I packed a small bag and left. I didn't wait for explanations. I didn't let anyone convince me I was making a mistake. Sometimes your body knows before your mind does. Story 32. I ran away from my wedding because of a message on the bathroom mirror. I was in the bridal suite, doing my final touch-ups, when I stepped into the bathroom to breathe for a second. That's when I saw it. Written on the mirror, in lipstick, "Don't marry him. He's lying to you." My heart stopped. At first, I thought it was a prank. But then I realized no one else had been in the room. I ran out and grabbed my maid of honor, asking if she'd done it. She swore she hadn't. Panic set in. What was he lying about? I pulled out my phone and, for the first time in months, went through his social media. I had trusted him blindly, never questioned anything. But now I looked. And that's how I found his secret second life. A private Instagram account. Hidden conversations. A whole other relationship that had been happening behind my back. I didn't even change out of my dress. I just grabbed my purse and walked out. Who wrote the message? I never found out. But whoever they were, they saved. Story 33. I left my wedding because my fiancé bet against. I always knew his friends were the rowdy, immature type. The kind who made stupid dares, who placed bets on everything. But I never thought he'd make a bet about. 15 minutes before the ceremony, I was waiting in the back when I overheard his groomsmen laughing. One of them said, "I still can't believe she actually went through with it. Guess you won." "And my fiancé?" He laughed. Another friend asked, "When are you telling her?" He just snorted and said, "What? That I only proposed because I bet I could get her to say yes? Yeah, probably never." My blood went ice cold. I didn't confront him. I didn't make a scene. I just grabbed my car keys, walked out the back door, and drove away. I heard later that he stood at the altar like an idiot, waiting. Bet he didn't see that coming. Story 34. I ran away from my wedding because my fiancé took my no as a joke. It started months before the wedding. Little things. He would make decisions for me, assuming I'd be fine with them. Picking the honeymoon location without asking. Inviting people I didn't even know to the guest list. I kept telling myself it was minor, that he was just excited. But then, 2 nights before the wedding, I saw the dress. Not my dress. A different dress. A bright red, body-hugging dress that looked nothing like the gown I had chosen. I asked him, confused, "Whose dress is this?" He grinned and said, "Yours. I had it custom made. I know you wanted white, but red is so much sexier. Trust me, you'll look amazing." I stared at him. "But I already have a dress." He waved me off. "You'll wear this one. It's better." I felt my chest tighten. This wasn't small. This wasn't minor. This was him making a massive decision for me and not caring that I had already said no. And that's when I realized this was the rest of my life. So instead of walking down the aisle in his dress, I walked out in my own clothes. Story 35. I left my wedding because my fiancé's vows weren't his own. The moment he started speaking, I knew something felt off. I had spent weeks writing my vows, making them personal, heartfelt. His, though? They sounded too perfect. Like something out of a movie. That's when I noticed my sister in the front row, her face pale, her hand covering her mouth. I locked eyes with her, and she shook her head, barely whispering. "He didn't write them." My stomach flipped. I pulled out my phone, typed a few words into Google, and there it was. His vows. Word for word. A famous monologue from a romantic movie. He hadn't written a single word for me. He couldn't even be bothered to express his own feelings. I looked up at him, feeling nothing. The officiant asked if I took him as my husband. I smiled, handed him my phone, and said, "You should have at least picked a lesser-known speech." Then I walked away. Story 36. I ran away from my wedding because my fiancé forgot my birthday. It sounds petty, but hear me out. We had been together for 2 years, and the wedding was set for a sunny Sunday afternoon. Everything seemed perfect. We had spent months planning, and the date was set. No going back, right? Then, 3 days before the wedding, I realized something was off. My fiancé, whom I'd been living with for almost a year, didn't even mention my birthday, which had just passed. It wasn't a big deal. I'm not the kind of person to throw extravagant celebrations, but he usually remembers, even with his busy schedule. When I asked him about it, he shrugged and said, "I was busy, sorry." I figured, okay, maybe he's stressed about the wedding. But then on the day of the ceremony, as I was waiting in the bridal suite, I overheard him joking with his groomsmen about how they needed to get him out of the house before his fiancée figured out what he was up to. I stood there frozen. Was he already feeling trapped? Was this the life I was about to marry into? I had a moment of clarity and a sense of complete dread. Instead of walking down the aisle, I sent a simple text to my maid of honor. "I can't do this." I changed into regular clothes, grabbed my purse, and left the venue. I never looked back. I spent the night with my best friend who took me on an impromptu trip to the beach. I realized I wasn't just walking away from the wedding. I was walking away from a relationship that had made me feel invisible. Story 37. I left my wedding because of a secret family heirloom. The morning of my wedding was perfect. The sun was shining, the flowers were fresh, and I was surrounded by my closest friends and family. I felt like I had everything I needed in life, except for one thing. My fiancé's grandmother had gifted me an heirloom bracelet, passed down through generations, as a wedding present. She said it symbolized strength and resilience. I didn't think much of it at first, but when I put it on, something about it felt wrong. The gold was cold against my skin and the clasp was unusually stiff. Later that day, when I went to the bathroom before the ceremony, I looked in the mirror and saw a name etched on the inside of the bracelet. Sarah. I froze. That was the name of his ex-girlfriend. The one he had been with for 6 years before we started dating. The one he never quite stopped talking about. The one his family still adored. I confronted him about it, and his face turned pale. It was a gift from my grandmother. It's tradition. But I knew this was his way of holding on to the past, of still being connected to a relationship that wasn't. I wasn't the first choice. I was a substitute. Instead of walking down the aisle, I walked straight out of the venue, took the bracelet off, and threw it in a nearby lake. I didn't even tell him I was leaving. Later, I heard he tried to find me, but he never understood why I left. I did, though. I left to preserve my own self-worth. Story 38. I ran away from my wedding because of the wedding planner. My fiancé had always been an easygoing guy, the type to avoid confrontation, always making jokes to smooth over tension. So when we hired a wedding planner to organize everything, I assumed she would handle all the little details while we enjoyed our engagement. But it wasn't the planning that bothered me. It was the way she treated me. At first, it was little things. She asked my fiancé if he wanted more input on the table settings while completely ignoring. She suggested changes to my dress without consulting me. And worst of all, when I tried to voice my concerns, she would smile and say, "It's all part of the process." The last straw came when I tried to change the flowers. My mother had suggested it, and I thought it would be a nice surprise. But when I brought it up, she snapped at me, saying, "I'm the expert here. Don't make this harder than it has to be." I looked at my fiancé, but he just shrugged and said, "She's just trying to help." In that moment, I realized I wasn't being listened to. So, the day of the wedding, I didn't walk down the aisle. Instead, I left the venue, packed my things, and went to the airport. I spent the next few days at my sister's house sipping coffee and watching old movies. I never even told him where I was. When he called and asked what happened, I simply said, "I realized I was planning a wedding that wasn't mine." Story 39. I left my wedding because of a lie that was too big to ignore. I had always suspected something was off, but I ignored it. After all, we had been dating for 4 years, and I was in love. But when I received a phone call from a number I didn't recognize, my world fell apart. The woman on the other end asked if I was marrying Sam. She sounded breathless, frantic. I confirmed, and she told me to look carefully at the guests. When I hung up, I felt like I was in a dream. I couldn't focus. My thoughts were spinning. I kept thinking about his last-minute trip 2 months ago, about how he'd been distant, about how he had forgotten important dates. I went through his phone while he was in the other room, and there it was, a series of messages from a woman he had met while traveling for work. They talked about their affair, their plans to meet up after the wedding. My heart sank. I had been so blind. I looked at myself in the mirror, dressed in my wedding gown, and realized this wasn't my future. Instead of walking down the aisle, I walked straight out of the venue, ignoring calls and texts. I left, not because I hated him, but because I deserved honesty. Story 40. I ran away from my wedding because of a small whispered question. We were standing at the altar, my fiancé and I, surrounded by friends and family. As the officiant was about to ask if we took each other as husband and wife, I heard a voice behind me, barely audible. Are you sure? It wasn't my mother. It wasn't my best friend. It was a man I hadn't even noticed sitting in the back, his face barely visible. His voice was familiar. I turned around, and he gave me a small, almost sad smile. He was an old acquaintance from college. We'd never been close, but something about him felt like a warning. I stared at him for a long moment, and then it hit me. He knew something I didn't. Before I could think, I blurted out, "I can't do this." The officiant asked, "What?" I turned to my fiancé, whose face was filled with confusion and shock. I said, "I don't think I should marry you." I grabbed my bouquet and ran out of the church, my heart racing. I didn't know who that man was or what he knew, but I trusted my gut, and I knew I wasn't ready to say, "I do." Story 41. I ran away from my wedding because I found out my fiancé was still living with his ex. We had been dating for 2 years, and he had been the perfect boyfriend. Loving, supportive, everything I wanted. As we started planning our wedding, I was excited to start our life together. Everything was falling into place, or so I thought. Then, 2 days before the wedding, I received a message on Facebook. It was from a woman I had never met. She introduced herself as Lindsay, and she said she needed to tell me something. I thought it was spam at first, but the next few messages weren't. She wrote, "I know you're marrying Jake, but I think you should know we're still living together. I'm not sure if he's told you, but he's been saying he's working late and leaving the house every night. I've seen him spend the night with you, but he never mentioned anything about us ending things. At first, I couldn't believe it. I asked him directly, and he denied it, claimed she was just jealous. But something in my gut told me it was true. I needed to confirm it. So, I drove to his house the morning of our wedding. There, I saw it with my own eyes. His toothbrush still in the bathroom next to hers. I looked around. There was no sign he was living alone. I didn't need any more proof. I texted him one final message. "I'm not going to marry you. I'm done." I never showed up for the ceremony. I spent the day alone, staying at a friend's house. Jake never understood why I left, but I couldn't go through with a marriage that was based on lies. Story 42. I left my wedding because my fiancé's mother tried to take control. We were standing there at the altar, ready to say our vows. The church was packed with family and friends, and everything seemed perfect. But then, as the officiant asked us to exchange vows, something happened that made me freeze in place. I felt a hand on my shoulder. It was my fiancé's mother, who had been overbearing throughout the entire wedding planning process. I looked up, confused, and she whispered, "Say it like this. I vow to serve my husband and honor his family above all else." I was in shock. We had gone over the vows together, and this was nothing like what we had planned. I tried to pull away, but she pushed harder, reminding me of my place. I thought I could ignore it, but something about her words struck me deep. I realized that if I went through with this marriage, I'd be committing to a life where my husband's family would always come first, and I would be expected to live for them, not for myself. I excused myself for a moment, slipped out of the church, and found my maid of honor waiting for me. "I can't do this," I told her. I left without saying a word to my fiancé or his mother. I spent the next few days in the mountains with my best friend, who reminded me of who I was before all of this. My fiancé still doesn't understand why I left, but I'm not sorry. Story 43. I ran away from my wedding because I found out my fiancé was a compulsive gambler. We were a month away from our wedding when I stumbled upon something that made my heart sink. My fiancé had always been responsible with money, or so I thought. We had discussed our future finances, but there was one thing he never mentioned, his gambling problem. One evening, I found a stack of unopened bills in a drawer. They were from casinos and online betting companies. It took me a minute to process what I was seeing. When I confronted him, he tried to brush it off, but I wasn't having it. He confessed that he had been gambling for years, running up huge debts that he was hiding from me. He promised he would stop, but I knew better. This wasn't just a phase, it was an addiction. The day before the wedding, I was standing in the bridal suite, my dress on, but all I could think about was how he had kept such a huge part of himself hidden from me. I couldn't marry someone who was lying to me about something so serious. I left before the ceremony, heading straight to the airport. The wedding guests were left confused. When he tried to call me, I just let it ring. I couldn't marry a man who couldn't be honest with me about something so vital. Story 44. I left my wedding because of an uninvited guest, my ex. I was in the middle of my wedding ceremony when I saw him, Matt, my ex. He had been a part of my life for over 5 years before we broke up. He had always been the one who got away. But I was happy now, or so I thought. My fiancé was standing beside me, his eyes full of love. But the moment I locked eyes with Matt, everything changed. Matt had shown up uninvited. He wasn't even supposed to be in the country at the time. But there he was, standing in the back of the church, looking at me with that same familiar gaze. I tried to ignore it, but I couldn't. I could see how my fiancé noticed the tension between us. The way Matt had always made me feel, well, safe. When my fiancé asked, "Are you ready to marry me?" the only thing I could think of was Matt. I knew in that moment that my feelings for my ex were still there, and they were stronger than I thought. I whispered to my fiancé, "I'm sorry. I can't do this." I turned, walked down the aisle, and straight out of the church. Matt followed me, and we sat in the parking lot talking for hours. We ended up taking a flight together, somewhere far away. I'm still not sure what will happen, but I know this was the only path for me. Story 45. I ran away from my wedding because I saw how my fiancé treated the staff. The venue was beautiful. Everything was arranged. I should have been happy, but as we were taking pictures before the ceremony, something happened that made my blood boil. The photographer asked my fiancé to adjust his position for a better shot. He sighed loudly, rolled his eyes, and snapped, "Hurry up! This is taking too long. My time is valuable." I watched as the photographer, a professional who had been nothing but polite, took a deep breath and continued, but my fiancé kept pushing. He went on to say something even worse to the catering staff. "If the food's late, I'm going to have words with someone." That's when I realized this wasn't a one-time thing. I couldn't marry someone who treated people with such disrespect. He didn't know how to be kind to others unless they were important to him. It was all about status and control with him. I excused myself, went to the restroom, and called my best friend. I told her to meet me outside. "I'm not marrying him," I said. I grabbed my bag, put on my sneakers, and left the venue. As I walked away, I realized that I was making the right decision, no matter how difficult it felt in the moment. Story 46. I ran away from my wedding because of a broken promise. I had been with Michael for 4 years. We had grown together, shared our dreams, and talked about building a future. We had everything in place, the venue, the rings, the dress. But somewhere along the way, I started feeling like something was missing. It wasn't until the night before the wedding that I realized what it was. We were sitting at dinner with his family when he casually mentioned that he had never planned on having kids. I froze. I knew we had talked about starting a family one day, but I didn't realize how serious he was about it. When I asked why, he shrugged. "I just don't want the hassle." I tried to laugh it off, thinking it was just a joke. But when I pressed him further, he got defensive and said, "Don't you understand? I didn't sign up for that. Why can't you just let it go?" The next morning, I stood in front of the mirror in my wedding dress, feeling like a stranger in my own life. I had never wanted to be with someone who didn't share the same values, especially something as important as raising a family. I didn't want a life where I was constantly compromising, and I certainly didn't want to marry someone who wasn't fully on board with the future we had once planned. Instead of walking down the aisle, I slipped out the back door. I left him a note. "You broke my heart with that promise. I won't marry you if it means giving up everything I've ever wanted. I don't regret leaving." Story 47. I left my wedding because of a sickening realization. It was the perfect day. I was standing at the altar, my fiancé in front of me, surrounded by our friends and family. Everything was going as planned until I saw my best friend walk in. She was wearing a dark green dress, and the moment she sat down, I couldn't take my eyes off her. I don't know why I noticed it in that moment, but her dress was too familiar. It was the same dress I had tried on months ago, the one I had considered buying for myself. I hadn't bought it, but she had, without telling me. As I stood there, trying to focus, I realized that there had been more similar moments over the years. The way she had stolen my spotlight at parties. The way she always seemed to be in the center of attention, even when I was the one hosting or planning. I had dismissed all of it in the past, but now it hit me with a wave of nausea. This wasn't just about a dress, it was about everything. She had always been the one to take the attention away from me, the one to undermine me when it mattered most. I couldn't marry someone who was still in love with my best friend. That was the moment I knew my fiancé had never truly seen me. So, as the officiant asked me if I took him as my husband, I took a deep breath, turned around, and walked out. I went straight to the car, drove to the airport, and left the country. I haven't looked back since.